people, what amazing tale do you have to tell? Story 1. I grew up in a small, conservative town where religion was a big part of the community. Life took a turn in 8th grade when my parents got divorced. My mom moved us to a slightly larger city, and I started hanging out with a crowd that was far more worldly than what I was used to. That summer, during my first house party, I met a guy known as Punk Rock Rob. He had that edgy, carefree vibe I found intriguing. A few months later, my friend and I decided to sneak over to a girl's house, but our adventure didn't go as planned. We got caught and kicked out. It was winter, freezing cold, and we had no place to go. Calling our parents wasn't an option. We told them we were staying at each other's houses. Desperate, we remembered that Punk Rock Rob worked at a sandwich shop nearby. We went there, hoping he'd give us a ride home. Instead, he invited us to a party in a bigger city. That's where things started getting uncomfortable. The area was rough, way outside my comfort zone. As the night went on, we realized Punk Rock Rob had connections to a crowd we absolutely didn't want to mess with. My friend and I spent the night on edge, trying to stay invisible. Thankfully, one of our other friends agreed to pick us up. It was one of the most surreal, nerve-wracking nights of my life. That experience changed how I viewed risks and the company I kept. From then on, I promised myself to be more careful about the situations I walked into. Story 2. During college, I had a habit of exploring the city and occasionally indulging in some recreational fun. Our campus was near Philadelphia, so one day, I decided to head into the city to get a haircut and do some exploring. As I wandered around, time slipped away, and I realized it was getting late. Worse, I had no idea how to get back. Lost and a little anxious, I asked a guy for directions. He looked like he knew the area, wearing a hoodie and hat, seeming comfortable in his surroundings. He introduced himself as Ron. Ron seemed friendly, and we struck up a conversation as he guided me toward the subway. He mentioned he was studying IT, and I told him about my major in communications. When we got close to my stop, he asked if I was going to any parties that night. That question threw me off a bit. He seemed much older than me, but I shrugged it off. He had helped me after all. After leaving the subway, Ron bought me a drink and made a quick call. Soon, a sleek black car pulled up. He got in, but it wasn't long before I saw him arguing with someone inside. He got out looking upset, which set off alarm bells in my head. We sat on a stoop for a bit, but he started making inappropriate comments to women passing by. I felt increasingly uneasy. Despite that, I stuck around a little longer, thinking I owed him for helping me earlier. Eventually, we went back to my dorm, where Ron surprised me by fixing some issues with my computer. Later, when I told my friends about the night, they couldn't believe I'd spent so much time with a stranger. I laughed it off, but deep down, I knew they were right to be worried. Ron called me a few weeks later, asking to hang out again. I politely declined. Another time, he tried selling me something, but I wasn't interested. That night taught me the importance of trusting my instincts and being cautious, no matter how friendly someone seems. Story 3. Back in college, one of my favorite ways to unwind was by exploring the city while enjoying some recreational fun. Our campus was close to Philadelphia, so one day, I decided to head into the city for a haircut and some aimless wandering. After hours of strolling, I realized it was getting dark, and I had no idea how to find my way back. Feeling a bit desperate, I approached a guy who seemed like a local. He introduced himself as Ron and agreed to help me get to the subway. As we walked, we struck up a conversation. Ron mentioned he was studying IT, and I told him about my communications major. Everything seemed fine at first, but as we got closer to my stop, he asked if I was planning to hit any parties. It felt a little strange, especially since he seemed older than me. After we left the subway, Ron bought me a drink and made a call. A black car pulled up and he got inside, but moments later, I saw him arguing with someone. He stormed out of the car, visibly upset, which made me feel uneasy. We sat on a nearby stoop, but Ron's behavior started to change. He began making inappropriate comments to women walking by, which left me feeling even more uncomfortable. Despite my reservations, I didn't leave. I felt like I owed him since he'd helped me earlier. Eventually, we ended up back at my dorm, where Ron unexpectedly fixed some issues with my computer. It was a strange end to an already bizarre night. When I told my friends, they were shocked I'd spent so much time with a stranger. They were right, it wasn't my smartest decision. Ron called me again a few weeks later, but I turned him down. That experience was a lesson in trusting my gut and being more careful. 27 years ago, I had the incredible opportunity to spend a year in California as part of a Rotary Club exchange program. At just 13 years old, I got to experience life in Los Angeles, attending school there for an entire year. It was an unforgettable adventure, even if nothing overly dramatic happened during my stay. When my exchange year ended, my parents decided to visit me for 2 weeks to see the place I'd called home for the past year. As we prepared to board our flight back, I went to the restroom while my parents waited at the gate. When I returned, I couldn't find them anywhere. To my shock, they had boarded the plane without realizing I wasn't with them. They were so used to me being independent over the past year that they accidentally left me behind, with my passport and boarding pass in their possession. Panicked but trying to stay calm, I explained the situation to the airport staff. Luckily, they managed to retrieve my documents from my parents. Once everything was sorted, I finally boarded the plane and walked down the aisle to my seat. As I approached my parents, I jokingly asked, "What was that all about?" My mom, holding up my passport and ticket, sheepishly admitted they didn't even notice I wasn't with them. The whole thing had been announced over the intercom, and the passengers around us burst into laughter. That moment became one of our favorite family stories to tell. My mom still insists it was an innocent mistake, but I like to remind her of how she almost left me behind in another country. Story 4. When my nieces were around 6 and 8 years old, they had a pet rat named Spider-Man. Spider-Man was a beloved little guy, but as he grew older, he started experiencing significant health issues, including tumors that caused him a lot of discomfort. My brother asked if I could take Spider-Man to the vet to see if anything could be done to ease his pain, and I agreed. That day, my nieces and I brought Spider-Man to the clinic. While we were waiting, Spider-Man was clearly in distress, making quite a bit of noise. When it was finally our turn, the vet, who admitted he'd never treated a rat before, examined him carefully. After a thorough check, the vet gently explained that the kindest course of action would be euthanasia, as there wasn't much else that could be done to improve Spider-Man's quality of life. As the vet began explaining how the procedure would work, Spider-Man suddenly bit his finger, and it was hard. A deep, sharp bite that startled him. In a shock, the vet reflexively flung Spider-Man, and to our horror, the rat hit the wall and passed away instantly. There was a stunned silence in the room. My nieces burst into tears, and the vet, horrified by what had just happened, apologized profusely. He felt awful and did everything he could to make up for the accident, giving the girls stuffed animals and a bunch of free supplies for their other pets. He even waived all charges for the visit. Despite the incident, I continued taking my pets to that vet for the next 15 years, and he's been wonderful ever since. Rest in peace, Spider-Man. You were truly loved. Story 5. About 3 years ago, right after graduating high school, my friends and I decided to go trekking in Iceland. After a week of camping in the wilderness, we thought we deserved a little comfort, so we booked an Airbnb in the city. The apartment was nice enough, though it had some unsettling artwork and a locked room that we didn't think much about at the time. On the last day of our trip, 2 of my friends went to return a tent we had borrowed from the host. Since he wasn't home, they ended up meeting his girlfriend instead. While they were there, she accidentally left the door to that locked room wide open. What they saw inside left them stunned. The room was filled with disturbing memorabilia, flags, books, and photographs that were deeply offensive and entirely inappropriate. Our group included people who were directly affected by the themes represented in that room, so discovering this was shocking and deeply unsettling. We took a few photos of the room before leaving, unsure of what to do. It was such a surreal moment, something you never expect when you're simply renting a place to relax. It completely overshadowed the rest of the trip and left us questioning the host's character. Story 6. While working as a receptionist at a hotel, I encountered all kinds of guests, but one incident will stay with me forever. The hotel was hosting an event for a company, which seemed pretty ordinary. Guests checked in, attended seminars, and stayed overnight. Nothing out of the ordinary. During the day, a woman came in with her 2 kids, asking for her husband. I looked up his name, called his room, and he came down to greet them. They seemed like the picture of a happy family, exchanging hugs and kisses in the lobby before heading out. That evening, after most guests had gone to bed, I noticed a couple lingering in the bar area. They were getting closer and closer, and before long, their behavior became a bit too inappropriate for a hotel lobby. Eventually, they headed toward the elevator, but instead of going up to the guest rooms, they went down to the basement. Curious, I checked the area afterward and found clear signs that they had continued their activities there. To my shock, I realized the man was the same guest whose family had visited earlier that day. Frustrated by his behavior, I did some online sleuthing and found his wife on social media. I decided to send her a message explaining what had happened, in case she needed evidence in the future. When the guest found out about my message, he was furious and came back to confront the hotel staff. Luckily, my manager had my back and supported me through the whole ordeal. That incident revealed a lot about people's true characters, both the guests and even some of my colleagues. Story 7. Years ago, I made the impulsive decision to drop out of school and join a band. Looking back, we weren't exactly the most talented group, but we had our moments. Our drummer, S, was going through a tough breakup around the time I joined, and the tension in the band was palpable. One night, our band manager came over to talk to us. She was venting about her ex, letting out all her frustration. In her anger, she made a comment about wishing her ex was gone, though it was clear she didn't really mean it. The manager casually said, "I'll take care of it," before leaving, but none of us thought much of it at the time. A couple of weeks later, S got a panicked call from her ex, who was being rushed to the hospital with severe stomach pains. Not long after, our manager came back and hinted that he was behind the ex's condition, saying he had handled it. We were shocked and started pressing him for answers. It turned out our manager worked in a lab and had access to various chemicals. He had devised a plan to give S's ex a substance that would cause a severe reaction. He'd offered the ex a pill under the pretense that it was for a headache, but the real intent was much darker. Fortunately, the manager had miscalculated the dosage, and the pill wasn't strong enough to cause permanent harm. Still, the realization of what he had tried to do was horrifying. That was the moment I realized how dangerous and unstable our manager truly was. We were all shaken, and it changed the way I saw not just the band, but the people I chose to surround myself with. Story 8. I once worked as a hotel room cleaner, but my career in housekeeping was cut short after just 3 days. On my 3rd day, I was still training with a coworker, and we were assigned to clean the King Suite as our last room of the day. At first glance, everything seemed pretty standard, a bit messy with empty beer bottles, pizza boxes, and a squash sitting on the counter. As we opened the closet, though, we were hit with an overwhelming stench. The source? A sheet that was supposed to be white but had turned an awful, dirty brown color. My coworker dealt with that while I focused on tidying the beds and cleaning the rest of the room. While scrubbing the kitchen's linoleum floor, my coworker noticed a strange residue and guessed the guest had spilled something. As I continued working, I picked up the squash from the counter, thinking it might make a cute decoration for fall. That's when I felt it, an odd, greasy film covering the surface. Curious, I took a closer sniff and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a regular squash. It was covered in something far more unpleasant. Suddenly, everything clicked. The mess on the floor, the filthy sheet, and now this. I turned to my coworker and blurted, "This thing has lube on it." That was my breaking point. I decided on the spot that this job wasn't for me. I walked out of the hotel and never looked back. And that, my friends, is the story of the infamous Ask Squash. Story 9. This story spans my life from the age of 12 or 13 until now. I grew up in a small, green, two-story house with my family of 5. My dad worked as a mechanic, and his boss, Frank, was a man I'd known for as long as I could remember. Life felt stable until everything changed. Frank was diagnosed with cancer and passed away, leaving my dad without a job. With no income, we struggled. My mom eventually found work at a grocery store, but it wasn't enough to make ends meet. Then, my dad's health took a sudden turn for the worse. He became seriously ill, unable to eat or drink without getting sick. After being hospitalized, he was diagnosed with diabetes. The doctors said that if he hadn't come in when he did, he might not have survived. To cope with the mounting challenges, we moved to Wisconsin to live with my grandparents. My mom found a job, and my dad began learning to manage his diabetes, though he was reluctant to take it seriously, even after it had saved his life more than once. Living with my grandparents came with its own difficulties. My dad and grandpa didn't get along, leading to frequent arguments. School was tough, and I made poor choices in who I hung out with, which left me feeling isolated. However, I found solace in music classes and the bond one shared with my grandma. Eventually, we moved in with my Uncle Tim. We lived in his basement, which was cramped but felt like home. For a while, I wasn't enrolled in school, so I spent my days watching anime and playing games. It was a strange time, both relaxing and deeply isolating. Things took another turn when Tim let someone else move in. Alex, the new tenant, had a sketchy past and made it clear he wanted us out of the house. Tensions rose, and my parents decided to send my brother and me to stay with our grandma temporarily. That period was marked by solitude and paranoia. I spent most of my time alone in a room. Looking back, those years in Wisconsin were a roller coaster of emotions, new friendships, deep loneliness, and constant upheaval. Despite it all, I kept pushing forward. Those challenges shaped how I view the world and the people around me, leaving an indelible mark on my life. Story 10. When I was in the army, a friend and I decided to grab some pizza one night. It turned out to be the best pizza I'd ever had. I devoured an entire pie by myself. Later, my buddy had plans to meet a girl he'd connected with online, and she had a friend who was interested in me as well. Things were looking promising, but the girls said they couldn't hang out in town. Instead, they suggested we follow them back to their place, which they claimed was only 20 minutes away. Being young and carefree, we agreed. But as we drove, the roads got darker, windier, and far more remote than we expected. An hour later, we pulled over briefly, and the girl who was supposed to be my match suddenly got out of the truck and did something unexpected. It wasn't a deal breaker, but at that point, I had a more pressing issue. I desperately needed to use the bathroom. I tried to relieve myself behind the car, but nothing was happening. It felt like a scene straight out of the Green Mile, a frustrating, seemingly endless struggle. Defeated, I climbed back into the car, still uncomfortable. After another 30 minutes of driving, we finally arrived at their place. To our surprise, their roommate was a fabulous drag queen in the middle of getting ready for a show. While my friend mingled, all I could think about was finding the bathroom. When I finally made it, let's just say it was an experience. I realized that my earlier struggle had been caused by being, well, completely backed up. The situation was messy, but I did my best to clean up. Meanwhile, I could hear commotion outside. My friend had tried to negotiate a three-way, and let's just say it didn't go over well. We were promptly kicked out of the house. As we were leaving, the drag queen ran out yelling, "What did you do to our toilet?" We jumped in the car and sped off, laughing at how absurd the entire night had been. Story 11. Back in 1996 or 97, I was a teenager living in a small town in Minnesota. My friends and I were obsessed with the idea of finding a hidden cannabis field inspired by movies we'd seen. One of my friends swore he knew of such a field on a nearby farm. Naturally, we had to check it out. We waited for the weekend, parked our car a short distance from the farm, and began walking toward the barn, eager to see the plants for ourselves. As we got closer, we saw chopped up stalks and leaves scattered across the ground. It looked like someone had just mowed them down. Convinced the plants might be drying inside the barn, we decided to investigate further. Once inside, I climbed up to the second floor for a better view. As I looked out, I spotted a truck speeding down the driveway straight toward the barn. Panic set in, and I shouted, "Run!" Without hesitation, I jumped out of the second floor window. Time seemed to slow as I fell, and when I hit the ground, I rolled and took off running. My friends quickly followed. We darted into the nearby cornfields, hiding as the truck circled the fields, clearly searching for us. After what felt like forever, the truck eventually gave up and returned to the house. Relieved, we regrouped and headed back to the car, only to find the police waiting for us. The officers questioned us, and when they found a growing guide in the car, they immediately knew what we were up to. Fortunately, we got off with just a trespassing warning. Although we got caught, it's a memory I'll never forget. I'm still good friends with those guys to this day, and we laugh about our misguided adventure whenever we get together. Story 12. When I was 18, I was deployed to Afghanistan as a cavalry scout with the Army. One night, we set up a concealed vehicle checkpoint in a dry riverbed north of Kandahar. We were told that locals rarely traveled at night, so anything we encountered would likely be suspicious. Just as we were about to pack up, 2 trucks appeared on the horizon and drove right into our checkpoint. When we pulled them over, we found they were packed with chickens in giant wire cages. The drivers were terrified, convinced we were going to harm them. They explained that a nearby police checkpoint in the mountain pass was actually a toll station where they were being robbed. We'd seen the checkpoint earlier, but at the time, it seemed quiet, manned by only 2 guards. My lieutenant decided we'd follow the chicken trucks back to the pass to investigate. As we approached, the checkpoint looked drastically different. It now had about 10 armed men instead of 2. We watched as one of the guards aggressively shoved his weapon into the chicken truck driver's window, demanding money. That was enough for us. We lit up our lights and stormed the checkpoint, rounding up the guards. While securing the area, someone pointed us toward a suspicious rock formation nearby. Inside, we discovered a hideout filled with more armed men, along with a stash of weapons, cash, and stolen goods. We detained everyone and secured the area, though we eventually had to release the men. However, my lieutenant wasn't about to let their stolen goods go to waste. When the grateful chicken truck drivers returned, he started handing back the money and items the robbers had taken. The drivers were overwhelmed with relief, laughing and crying as they thanked us repeatedly. That night completely changed how we approached every checkpoint from then on. It's a story I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Story 13. About 3 years ago, I had one of the scariest experiences of my life when someone tried to hijack my vehicle. Thursday nights were my usual hangout time with friends, playing Magic, The Gathering, and watching videos. I'd often head home around 2 or 3 a.m. Living near the University of Notre Dame in northern Indiana, I knew crime wasn't uncommon in surrounding areas, but it was rarely a concern near campus. One July night, as I drove home, I pulled up to a stoplight. Beside me was an old Ford Explorer rocking back and forth, as if someone inside was headbanging to loud music. I didn't think much of it until the light turned green. Suddenly, the Explorer sped in front of me and slammed on its brakes, forcing me to stop. Confused, I tried to go around, but the driver pulled a U-turn to face me directly. That's when I realized this wasn't random. It was deliberate. I hit the gas and sped past him, but he caught up quickly. As he pulled up beside my Jeep, I glanced over and saw a man with a sneer, holding something in his hand that I feared might be a weapon. He overtook me again and came to an abrupt stop, but I managed to veer into a side street, hoping to lose him in a residential area. As I fumbled to call 911, I noticed his headlights swerving erratically behind me, like something out of a horror movie. The operator finally picked up, and I yelled into my phone, explaining that I was being chased. I made a sharp turn into my apartment complex and looked in the rearview mirror just in time to see his car lose control and veer into a ditch. I drove to a nearby parking lot and hid my car, still on the line with 911. When the police arrived about 15 minutes later, I told them everything that had happened. They informed me that the man had abandoned his vehicle after blowing out a front tire during the turn. I never found out who he was or why he targeted me, but for the next month, I parked in a different lot just to be safe. I'm not religious, but if there's any kind of higher power out there, I'm grateful for getting out of that situation unharmed. Story 14. When I was around 18, I had a pretty typical night planned, relaxing on my balcony and soaking in the quiet. It was late, but my neighborhood was safe, so I decided to go for a walk to clear my head before bed. I grabbed my camera bag, as I often did, just in case I found something interesting to capture. As I reached an intersection, a loud, lowered Chevy Silverado pulled up to the stoplight, revving its engine like it wanted all the attention in the world. Intrigued, I pulled out my camera and started snapping photos. The driver decided to put on a show, doing a burnout that filled the air with smoke and rubber, a spectacle that was oddly mesmerizing. The guy in the passenger seat waved me over, and I assumed he wanted to chat or see the photos. But before I could even get close, the light turned green and he yelled, "Jump in the truck." Without thinking too hard about it, I did exactly that, hopping into the bed of the truck. To my surprise, 3 other people were already back there, lying down like it was no big deal. I squeezed in, laying sideways against the tailgate, and held on for dear life as the truck tore off down the road at what felt like 100 miles per hour. One of the guys reached out to steady me, which was both comforting and a little unnerving. The truck eventually screeched to a stop outside a nightclub. The group was ecstatic that I'd joined their wild ride, and a man with a thick Eastern European accent laughed as he said, "You're crazy for jumping into that truck." They introduced themselves as Newfoundlanders who'd recently moved to Louisiana, and despite the chaos, they were surprisingly welcoming. Unfortunately, I hadn't planned on a night out and didn't have my wallet or ID. One of the guys handed me an ID belonging to a 40-year-old man who vaguely resembled me. Somehow it worked, and I got into the club. We spent the night drinking, laughing, and dancing. Later, we ended up at someone's house, sharing wine with a friendly older woman and a very animated Russian guy. When it was time to leave, I asked them to drop me off as close to where they'd picked me up as possible. Back in the bed of the truck, I watched the city lights blur past until, to my surprise, the truck pulled up right at the gate of my apartment complex. Turns out these guys lived just a few buildings over, and I'd never even noticed. After that wild night, I never saw them again, but it's a memory that still makes me smile. Story 15. One night, I was hanging out with 3 friends, enjoying what started as a typical evening. After getting dropped off at my girlfriend's house, my friends went to grab some supplies. A few hours later, they came back to pick me up, and we all decided to head home together. Unfortunately, all of our phones died, and without GPS, we got hopelessly lost. We took wrong turn after wrong turn until we found ourselves crossing a set of railroad tracks in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless farmland. That's when the car got stuck, right on the tracks. Panic set in as we realized we were in serious trouble. Our friend Buddy, originally from Liberia, decided to take action and ran to a nearby farmhouse to ask for help. But the farmer, clearly wary of strangers, came out with a shotgun and told us to get off his property. Just then, we heard the distant sound of a train approaching. The panic turned into sheer terror. We sprinted back to the car, grabbing whatever we could, and ran for cover. I'll never forget the sight of that train barreling toward our car. It felt like time slowed as the train collided with it, sparks flying everywhere. The noise was deafening, and the surreal sight of our tiny car crumpling under the massive locomotive is something I'll never forget. Thankfully, we all managed to get to safety just in time. We were shaken, but unharmed. At the time, we were all under 18 except for Buddy. That night remains one of the craziest and scariest experiences of my life. Story 16. My family, friends, and I decided to take a long 13-hour drive to Panama City Beach for spring break. We were exhausted but excited, counting down the minutes until we arrived. Then, just 20 minutes from our destination, we got a flat tire. After quickly swapping it out for the spare, we finally made it to the beach. My cousin pointed out the red flag flying near the water and joked that it probably meant the waves would be awesome. None of us questioned it. We were too eager to dive in. The moment we hit the sand, 5 of us sprinted straight into the water. The waves were strong, stronger than I'd ever experienced. Before we realized it, the current had pulled us farther and farther from the shore. I was lucky to be near one of my bigger friends, but I'd spent years teasing him with silly jokes. When I reached out for his hand, he actually hesitated for a moment before helping me swim back to shore. Just as I thought I was safe, I heard my other cousin shouting for help. He was still struggling against the current. For a split second, I hesitated. I wasn't a strong swimmer, and I knew going back out there could be dangerous. But then I thought, what would a hero do? I swam back out, and together, we linked hands and fought our way toward the shore. The current was relentless, but we managed to push forward. Just when I started to lose hope, my cousins grabbed me, and somehow, we all made it back to land. Exhausted but safe, we collapsed on the sand. Everyone was okay, and now we laugh about how we nearly got swept away that day. But looking back, it was a humbling reminder of how powerful the ocean can be and how close we came to disaster. Story 17. Back in December 2014, just a few days before Christmas, I matched with a nurse on Tinder while visiting home in Hawaii. Our conversations went well, so we decided to meet up. But when she invited me to visit her at work, I was a bit surprised. It wasn't exactly a usual first date plan. She quickly sent me her location, and when I pulled up, I realized it wasn't a hospital or a clinic. It was just a house. Feeling confused, I called her, and she came outside in her nurse's uniform. Seeing the look on my face, she explained that she worked as an in-home caretaker. I'll admit, I felt uneasy about meeting her at someone else's house, but she assured me it was fine. "Don't worry," she said. "She won't even know you're here." That comment didn't do much to ease my nerves, but curiosity got the better of me, so I followed her inside. The main room was dimly lit, and in the center of it was an elderly woman lying in a medical bed. Her mouth was slightly open, and her eyes were closed. She looked completely lifeless. The nurse explained that the woman had been in this state for months. As I glanced around, I noticed the room was sparse. No family photos, just a few old Christmas cards signed by someone she called her brother. The atmosphere was heavy, but the nurse seemed unfazed. After a brief conversation, she led me to a small back room with a cluttered bed. We sat down, and one thing led to another. I still felt uneasy, but I went along with it anyway. Afterward, we returned to the main room and put on an NHL game. I sat there, just an arm's length away from the elderly woman, feeling an unsettling mix of guilt and confusion. Months later, I found myself thinking about that night. Out of curiosity, I looked up the woman's name to see if she was still alive. I discovered that she had passed away just 2 days after my visit. The entire experience was strange and left me with an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't quite shake. Even now, I think about it sometimes, wondering if I should have handled things differently or if I should have even gone in at all. Story 18. When I was about 12, one of my chores was feeding the dogs that we kept in a kennel out in the barn. It was a routine task, and that evening seemed like any other, until I started walking back to the house. As I made my way across the yard, I heard a low hum in the sky. It was a sound I'd never heard before, and it made me stop in my tracks. I looked up and saw something that still gives me chills to this day. A perfect cube, floating about 300 feet above the ground. The cube was massive, with bright orange lights flashing across its surface. It glided smoothly through the sky, moving at around 30 miles per hour without tumbling or spinning. It was like a die just floating effortlessly in the air. I was so excited and terrified that I sprinted back to the house as fast as I could, yelling for my dad to come see it. Just as I reached the porch, something incredible happened. The cube stopped moving completely, hovering silently in place. Then, in an instant, it shot straight up into the sky at a speed I couldn't comprehend. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, completely vanished. To this day, 22 years later, I have no idea what I saw that night. I've spent countless hours replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Sometimes, I wonder if it could have been a dream, but my dad still remembers me bursting into the house that night, hysterical and struggling to explain what I'd seen. It's one of those moments that sticks with you, a mystery I'll probably never solve but will always think about.